figuring out exactly what to do with Donald Trump's federal criminal cases. Here's the question. Is there a way for him to temporarily end the cases such that they can be rebrought? They can commence again the minute Donald Trump leaves office? Let's talk about that, because justice still matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, I'm sure you've seen the reporting about how Special Counsel Jack Smith is in the process of, quote, winding down, close quote, the two federal criminal prosecutions of Donald Trump, one for trying to steal the 2020 presidential election, right? For obstructing an official congressional proceeding, the certification of Joe Biden's election win. He's charged with conspiracy. He's charged with violating our voting rights. And of course, the second criminal case is for Donald Trump taking and unlawfully retaining classified information, some of our nation's most closely guarded national security secrets, obstructing justice by refusing to return them when they were subpoenaed by the grand jury, and of course violating our nation's espionage laws because of the national defense information he took and unlawfully retained. But before I go to the new reporting on how Jack Smith may be able to preserve for future prosecution these two criminal cases, it's Sunday. So I want to air out one thing for just a few minutes, right? Let's talk about this justice thing, because really ever since the election, I have had countless messages across all platforms, insisting that justice doesn't matter, yelling at me in all caps, Glenn, it's clear justice doesn't matter, even people cussing me out. But you know what? I've been cussed out by some of the best. I grew up in a football household. My pop was a high school football coach and an Army veteran. I went on to serve active duty in the Army for 6.5 years. I was a homicide prosecutor and a RICO prosecutor for decades. I've been cussed at by lots and lots and lots of people. I've been yelled at by lots of judges, civilian and military, trial court and appellate court, federal, state, and local. And I understand. I understand the upset, the frustration, the desperation, the depression, where, people seem to be at the end of their rope. They seem to have concluded or feel like justice doesn't matter. And people yell and lash out. And to me, the fact that people are yelling and lashing out, and they're so upset by what has gone on, Donald Trump seeming to escape criminal responsibility for all of the crimes he obviously committed, for which he's been indicted by grand jury after grand jury after grand jury after grand jury. The fact that people are so upset sort of proves the point that justice matters to them, to us. Because if it didn't matter, then all of this injustice wouldn't upset us so much. So yes, it still matters, even if the rule of law seems to be, lying dormant, in hibernation, on ice for the moment. It still matters, and we still have to keep fighting for it, even when times are dark. So thank you for indulging me that response to the many messages, understandable messages that I get about how justice doesn't matter. It does matter, and we will keep fighting for it. Now, let's turn to the new reporting, specifically on, what might Jack Smith be able to do as he's winding down these federal prosecutions of Donald Trump to preserve the ability of prosecutors in the future to rebring these cases, to jumpstart them, to commence the prosecution where it is being left off now that Donald Trump is headed back to office. And I'm going to read a Newsweek article. It's fairly short, but I think the whole thing is worth reading. It's quoting a friend and fellow legal analyst, Barb McQuade, and I thoroughly respect Barb's opinion and her take on this issue. The issue being, is there any hope for these prosecutions to be brought back into life, back into existence, as soon as Donald Trump leaves office? Headline, Jack Smith may be able to revive Donald Trump cases, says legal analyst Barb McQuade. And that article begins, following the outcome of this year's presidential election, in which Donald Trump won a second term, legal analyst Barbara McQuade said on Saturday that Department of Justice, DOJ Special Counsel Jack Smith, may be able to revive the criminal cases he launched against the president-elect. Trump, who won the 2024 election over Vice President Kamala Harris, still has two pending criminal matters, his federal 2020 election subversion case and the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case that it looks like are about to be set aside due to his victory, since sitting presidents cannot be criminally prosecuted under the law. The president-elect has pleaded not guilty to all charges in the cases. However, with these cases yet to go to trial, Trump has vowed to dismiss Smith, quote, within 2 seconds of assuming office, as he told conservative radio host Hugh Hewitt in October. However, the New York Times reported on Wednesday that Smith intends to conclude his work and step down with his team before then, completing all significant aspects of the investigations himself. Smith's office is currently developing a strategy to conclude the cases, though unforeseen factors, including court rulings or actions by other government officials, could potentially affect his timeline. In a Saturday interview appearance on MSNBC's The Katie Phang Show, McQuade, a former United States attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan under the Barack Obama administration, spoke about Smith's reported plans and how he may be able to revive Trump's cases. This quote from Barb McQuade, quote, I have heard from a number of people saying, why should Jack Smith pull the plug on his own case? Why not just let Trump fire him, make him go through that exercise so that people can see that it was Trump who ended this? And I think it's because Jack Smith can have a lot more control if he ends it on his own terms, McQuade said. This quote from Barb McQuade, quote, I have heard from a number of people saying, why should Jack Smith pull the plug on his own case? Why not just let Trump fire him, make him go through that exercise so that people can see that it was Trump who ended this? And I think it's because Jack Smith can have a lot more control if he ends it on his own terms, McQuade said. She explained, there are a couple of things he can do. One is to issue a full-throated report on both of the cases, the January 6th election interference case, as well as the documents case in Florida, those two things. The other thing he could do, and I don't know if this would withstand all of the machinations that Trump will certainly try to put up against it, to dismiss the cases without prejudice and make the argument later that the statute of limitations is tolled, meaning is paused, during the Trump presidency and revive the cases in 2029. I think there's a 50-50 shot that succeeds. McQuade said that it would put the Trump administration in the untenable spot of either accepting that or having to refile the cases just so they can dismiss them with prejudice. Okay, friends, I think this is going to call for a short Team Justice Law School class. There's a lot to unpack here. The way I see it, Jack Smith has essentially three options, three possibilities. There are some variations on these three options, but I'm going to stick with three options. But we have to start by talking about what happens when a criminal case gets dismissed, like Donald Trump's 2 federal prosecutions that are, currently in existence. So there are 2 ways a judge can dismiss a criminal case, with prejudice or without prejudice. The vast majority of criminal cases that get dismissed without prejudice. What does that mean? That means those cases can be brought again by prosecutors in the future when and if the time and the circumstances are right. When might a prosecutor move to dismiss a case without prejudice. Ask a judge to dismiss the case, but letting the prosecutor consider rebringing the case in the future. Well, for example, if I'm prosecuting somebody in the courts of Washington, D.C., and my fellow prosecutors in Maryland or in Virginia are prosecuting that same defendant, I might want to dismiss my case without prejudice, await the outcomes of the other criminal prosecutions, and then make a decision whether it still made sense, taking into account, the desires of the victims and of the community and public safety, whether it still made sense to rebring the prosecution in D.C., depending on the outcome of the other criminal prosecutions. That is a perfectly ordinary and appropriate sort of tactical decision when to dismiss a case without prejudice. When do judges dismiss cases with prejudice? Essentially, when the prosecutors, the government, need to be punished for doing something wrong, for maybe intentionally violating procedural or legal or constitutional rights of a defendant. Like if a prosecutor intentionally hides all of the exculpatory evidence that the Constitution says we as prosecutors must give over to the defendant so he or she can fully defend themselves, a prosecutor decides to hide it, violating a defendant's constitutional rights. A court could say, I am granting the motion to dismiss based on governmental misconduct, and I am dismissing with prejudice. So the prosecution is being punished. The prosecution can never rebring that case. Okay, that's the difference between dismissing a case with prejudice, dismissing a case without prejudice. Here are the three options that I think Jack Smith has, the three primary options. One, don't dismiss the cases at all. Leave the cases in existence, and then when Donald Trump is sworn in, he can have his attorney general just sort of nefariously, maybe even corruptly, dismiss the criminal cases against Donald Trump. We can see that coming a mile away, right? And then that attorney general might say, oh, and judge, we want you to dismiss it with prejudice because we think the whole thing was a witch hunt. If a judge dismisses it with prejudice, then when Donald Trump leaves office, new law-abiding prosecutors, a new law-abiding Department of Justice could not bring those cases back, couldn't refile them, couldn't reindict them. That is one thing that Jack Smith could do. Just let the Trump administration nefariously dismiss those cases in its zeal to protect a criminal president. Here's the second option. Jack Smith could dismiss the cases on his own, asking the courts to dismiss them without prejudice, meaning those cases could be rebrought, reindicted, prosecuted anew in the future, unless the statute of limitations expires. Most crimes have a 5-year statute of limitations. What does that mean? It means if you don't commence the prosecution within 5 years of the crime having been committed, you're out of luck. The prosecutions are time barred. So one of my concerns is that if Jack Smith asks the court to dismiss the case without prejudice, that 5-year statute of limitations will expire while Donald Trump is in office for his second term, assuming he stays for the whole 4 years. Who knows? Maybe midway through he negotiates a quid pro quo deal with his vice president, J.D. Vance. Hey, J.D., you give me a pardon, I'll resign and give you the presidency. Donald Trump will, slouch off to Mar-a-Lago to play golf. Who knows what's going to happen? But the risk is when 5 years elapses from the time of Donald Trump's crimes, then the statute of limitations will say, sorry, prosecutors, Department of Justice, people of the United States, you're out of luck. The time frame has expired for prosecutors to rebring the case. So Jack Smith would be left to argue, this is feeling like an advanced criminal law and criminal procedure class, please bear with me, friends. Jack Smith would be left to argue, well, I'm going to ask the judge to dismiss the case without prejudice, but I'm going to do so, Your Honor, under the assumption that the statute of limitations will stop. It will pause while Donald Trump is in office. Why? Because the Department of Justice has a policy that says it's not a good idea for a sitting criminal president to be prosecuted while in office. It's a horrendous policy that moves us in the direction of a banana republic, in my opinion, but that's DOJ policy. And that is part of the reason why Jack Smith is finding himself potentially having to dismiss these cases because the prosecutions can't move forward while Trump is in office. Here's my concern about that approach: asking the court to dismiss without prejudice and argue that the statute of limitations should be tolled, it should be paused, it should stop, shouldn't run while Donald Trump is in office. A court 5 years from now may say, look, there's no law that says you can't prosecute a sitting criminal president. There's no statute, there's no precedent. You may have a policy, but a policy doesn't override the statute of limitations, which has the force of law. So that attempt to put in place safeguards to be able to re-bring the case, re-indict the case, start prosecuting it again when Donald Trump leaves office may not work. Here is the third option. I think it's an outlier, but I want to mention it anyway. Jack Smith could ask, for example, Judge Chutkan, who's presiding over Trump's D.C. prosecution, could ask Judge Chutkan to just put the case on pause. Stay the case until Donald Trump is no longer in office, and then it will pick up right where it left off. You know, in an analogous circumstance, which we've all lived through recently, when a case is appealed to the Court of Appeals and ultimately the Supreme Court, like Donald Trump's presidential immunity claim was, what happened to Judge Chutkan's prosecution? It stopped. It paused. It was stayed pending appeal. This would be a variation on that theme, asking Judge Chutkan to order that it just be paused until Donald Trump leaves office, and that pause would also stop or toll or pause the statute of limitations from running and from running out. Of course, then we're right back to the problem of Donald Trump ordering a corrupt attorney general to just throw out his cases and do it with prejudice so they can never be rebrought against me, Donald Trump. Those are the three options as I see them. There are variations on those three options, and I have no idea which way Jack Smith might be leaning, but we will know certainly in the coming weeks and months, well in advance of January 20th, I suspect. Here's the last thing, and this is what I want to finish with. Thank you for spending all this time with me on this Sunday as I try to unravel all of these legal issues. Jack Smith must issue a special counsel report. Now, not by law, I'm not saying he must, but he needs to issue a special counsel report laying bare all of the evidence of Donald Trump's crimes in both federal cases because, well, one, it's just the right thing to do. The American people have every right to know what their president did to try to steal the 2020 presidential election and what their president did or their former president did to put our nation, at risk on the national security front by taking and unlawfully retaining, classified information. And as importantly, if all of this evidence is not disclosed publicly in a special counsel report, then Donald Trump and his Attorney General and his Department of Justice potentially could destroy it all. And it would never see the light of day, and it would never be able to be used in future prosecutions in the event these cases can be rebrought, reindicted, and prosecuted after Donald Trump leaves office. They should be. They should be. Because justice still matters. Thank you, friends. Please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.